From time to time, people ask to talk with me because of some weight of guilt they are carrying. It's often related to conflict within their families. They are worried that they have strained or broken important relationships because of something they've said or did. As I listen to them, almost every time I notice that they're being kind of harsh towards themselves. When I offer counsel to them, I usually say, "It sounds like you're taking on too much of the responsibility here. Other people had a hand in this, and the circumstances were just unlucky. The invitation from God, I hear, is to let yourself off the hook of your own judgment." By contrast, the people I've known who really do cause a lot of harm, whose words and actions are devastating to the people around them, those people don't admit anything at all. It's like their self-righteousness is a force field that repels all guilt and responsibility. Those people should be harder on themselves. God's invitation to them is to admit what they have done wrong. It's rare, in my experience, to encounter a person like Eli. To appreciate how remarkable he is, we need to flesh out his character a little. Many of us first heard of Eli in Sunday school, when we learned the story of the call of Samuel. We might have marveled at Eli's patience with Samuel. I know I would not be that kind and understanding after being woken up 3 times in the middle of the night. But there's more to Eli than his guidance of a child prophet just figuring out his call. In the early days of the Israelite people, before there is a temple in Jerusalem, Eli is a priest at the shrine of God in Shiloh. His role is to offer sacrifices to God. Pilgrims would bring animals to Shiloh to offer to God. The priest would ritually butcher the animals and then burn the meat as an offering. A woman called Hannah comes to Shiloh to pray. She is struggling with infertility and is desperate to have a child. Hannah pours her heart out to God. She promises that if God gives her a son, she will dedicate her child to God's service. Hannah is moving her mouth, but her prayer is silent. And Eli, the priest who's supposed to help people reach God, assumes she is drunk and tries to kick her out. Hannah defends herself, pointing out that she is not drunk, just praying fervently. And Eli backs down. He asks God to grant Hannah's prayer, which God does. Hannah soon gives birth to Samuel. Still, this doesn't speak well of Eli. Surely, as a priest, he's familiar with people in anguish. Instead of talking to a distressed person and asking what's going on, he assumes the worst. This doesn't bode well for Eli as a spiritual leader. Indeed, things get worse. Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are also priests at Shiloh. Priests are entitled to a share of the meat from the animal sacrifices, but only after they are burned. The fat of the animal belongs to God, and God has to come first. After the carcasses are burned, they are stewed, and the priests get some of the stewed meat. But Hophni and Phinehas insist on taking their part before the animals are burned. They are stealing what belongs to God. When pilgrims try to tell them that's not right, Hophni and Phinehas take what they want by force. They are also assaulting women who come to serve at the shrine of Shiloh. Eli's sons are a pair of violent thugs masquerading as religious leaders. Eli knows it, and he does nothing. He doesn't protect the pilgrims and the women servants. He doesn't rebuke his sons for their sins against God. He stands back and lets them do what they want. Eli's eyesight has begun to grow dim, but it's not just his vision that is failing. Eli is not able to perceive God's activity or hear God's words. That's been so for a long time, possibly the entire time Eli has been a priest. He, his sons, most of the Israelites have gotten used to God's silence, as though God is absent. But God is very much present and active. God is still speaking, even if hardly anyone is paying attention. God speaks to young Samuel, calling him in the night until Samuel and Eli realize that what Samuel is hearing is the voice of God. Samuel says, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." There's a long tradition of people saying that to God. Abraham, Jacob, Moses, Isaiah all say those words. And when you say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening," you're being called to a task or a role that's going to be difficult. For Abraham, it was sacrificing his son Isaac. For Jacob, it was facing his twin brother Esau, whom he'd cheated out of his inheritance. For Moses, it was the call to go back to Egypt and challenge Pharaoh to set God's people free. For Isaiah, it's speaking the truth to Israel. For Samuel, the difficult task is pronouncing judgment on Eli for his failures as a priest and as a parent. Samuel's just a child. This is a lot to ask of a kid. To call out corruption in your spiritual and physical home, to upend the institution that has nurtured and protected you, to tell the mentor who has raised you that God condemns him. In the morning, Eli wants to know what God said to Samuel. From Samuel's nervy silence, Eli can tell it's not going to be good news. You can feel him bracing himself to prepare for the worst. But Eli wants to hear it. And Eli's reaction is really striking. He doesn't flagellate himself and exaggerate his guilt. He doesn't reject God's judgment, shouting and raging that he did nothing wrong. He accepts it. Eli has this quality of seeing himself clearly. He did mess up. His failure to act has caused a lot of damage. He deserves the consequences he's about to receive. Eli almost seems relieved to have the judgment pronounced at last. It's as though he knew this was coming. And now that it has, he doesn't have to worry about it or be afraid of it anymore. He can set down the weight he has been carrying. I've been thinking about Eli a lot this week, as more news comes out about the storming of the Capitol and as we brace for the possibility of more violence to come. What got me thinking was the photo of a rioter clutching a Bible to his chest. The cross the insurrectionists put up on the Capitol grounds, not far from the gallows they erected. The words of several rioters that conflate Jesus with the current president. Many of those who attempted the overthrow of a free and fair election, whose violent actions caused the death of 5 people, claim the faith of Jesus Christ. Many of us in more progressive denominations like the Episcopal Church might want to shake our heads, disavow this kind of Christian nationalism fused with white supremacy, and move on as though it's nothing to do with us. Some of us, the ones who tend to be kind of harsh towards ourselves, might want to beat ourselves up for this, as though we are responsible for the actions of all Christians. But what would it be like to be like Eli? To own the truth of our responsibility? Not to put up a force field of denial or flagellate ourselves, but to be honest with ourselves and with God. and to accept God's judgment. I think of Episcopalians, including me, saying with pride, you know, every other major denomination split over slavery, but the Episcopal Church never did, as though it is praiseworthy that we chose unity over the freedom of our fellow children of God. I think of the way we ceded the term Christian to conservative evangelicals without fighting for it. And now that word means hatefulness, intolerance, and hypocrisy to many people, instead of the way of love, the way of Jesus. I note with shame that when two Black men, Casey Goodson Jr. and Andre Hill, were shot and killed by police in Columbus last month, no one at St. John's, including me, none of us thought to include their families in our prayers. Prayer was the least we could do, and we didn't even do that. We did not storm the Capitol or incite violence. We're not responsible for that. We're not completely innocent either. I said last Sunday that God is truth, and being the people of God means being people of truth. We seek out truth and speak truth and act out of the truth. That includes the truth about ourselves, what we have done and what we have left undone. It was so important for Eli to acknowledge the truth of his sin because owning the truth is the first step to healing. Eli couldn't begin to change without admitting that he was partly to blame for his sons offending God and harming their people. But once Eli did that, a different future became possible. What enabled Eli to receive the truth of his sin with such composure was his utter certainty that nothing we do can separate us from the love of God. Eli had to face the consequences of his failure to discipline his sons. God's punishment was that both of his sons were killed in battle. I imagine it took a lot of work for Eli to build trust with the people who came to the shrine at Shiloh. But God continued to love Eli, God's precious, wayward, beloved child. And God was with Eli as he made amends for the harm he had caused. God guided and strengthened him as he did the work he had to do. God continues to love us too, God's precious, beloved, wayward children. We have a lot of work ahead of us to atone for the sin of racism and heal our hurting country. And as we do it, God is with us, guiding and strengthening us as we do the work God has given us to do.